The final decisive victory in World War II was not won on the battlefield, it was won in the minds of the enemy. And the ultimate weapon was not the tank or the bomb, but the sheer, relentless reality of American industrial might and democratic abundance. This is the story of how hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war, POWs, the dedicated soldiers, the loyal Nazis, the engineers and farmers, were transported to the heart of the decadent, weak, and collapsing enemy nation, only to witness a terrifying, unimaginable truth that dissolved the very foundation of Nazi ideology. The collapse began not with a battle, but with a train ride. On June 4, 1943, a passenger train, not a cattle car, not a filthy freight wagon, but a comfortable Pullman coach with sleeping berths and dining services, rolled into Mexia, Texas. Stepping onto the platform were 1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's elite Africa Corps. These men, seasoned desert fighters who had believed they belonged to the master race, were greeted by a scene that instantly contradicted 3 years of meticulous Nazi propaganda. Private Hedman Friedrich Rodke, a holder of the Iron Cross, recorded in his hidden diary, "The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on 2 fronts." The first, most profound shock was the light. Since 1940, German citizens had lived under a strict, mandated blackout. Towns and cities were plunged into darkness for fear of Allied bombers. Rural Germany was lucky to have 20% electrification. Yet through the train windows at 10 p.m., the POWs saw an endless constellation of electric lights, lights blazing from every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window across the Texas plains. Electricity, which was a strategic, carefully rationed commodity in the Reich, flowed here like water. This effortless, endless supply of power was the first visible sign that their war was not just strategically compromised, but materially lost. The journey to captivity was a 3-day continuous psychological demolition. The journey had begun in Algeria, where the Africa Corps, having surrendered in Tunisia on May 13, 1943, were processed with an organizational precision that surpassed anything the Wehrmacht had achieved at its peak. They received identity cards, medical examinations, and inoculations, with their Geneva Convention rights explained in fluent German, a level of professional, humane organization that shocked them. But it was the food that delivered the first major ideological hit. Oberreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote home 8 months later, "While we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration." The 2-week Atlantic crossing in July 1943 continued the educational process. The prisoners were transported on Liberty ships, vessels themselves floating monuments to American industrial capacity. The crew of the SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. At the peak of production, American shipyards were launching 3 such ships per day. This fact, which would have been dismissed as ridiculous propaganda in Germany, was a terrifying reality. These were not specialized vessels, they were interchangeable components of an industrial machine that could produce more ships than the entire German U-boat fleet could sink. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann noted that the ship's crew disposed of more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations in Africa. Half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk were thrown overboard, openly, without thought, because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. This carelessness, born of infinite resource, was incomprehensible to men schooled in the Nazi philosophy of scarcity and conquest. Lieutenant Colonel William von Staubern, whose aristocratic family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, made the most telling observation as they approached the American coast. He saw the radar antenna rotating above the cargo ship's bridge. This technology, he later wrote, which we believed only we and perhaps the British possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war. The technological edge, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was now a standard feature on an enemy supply ship. The entire journey was not a transport operation, it was a curated, involuntary immersion course on the irrefutable logistics of defeat. The war was not being lost due to poor generalship, as Hitler claimed, but due to a fundamental, incurable imbalance of production. If the initial voyage across the Atlantic was a psychological assault, the reality of life in the United States delivered the crippling final blow to the Nazi worldview. The German soldiers were transported not just to prisoner camps, but to a vast, sprawling, and incomprehensible empire of production that defied the fundamental Nazi premise of scarcity. The German war machine was built on the idea that they must conquer resources because Europe was finite. The United States operated on the principle that its resources were boundless. The prisoners, over 400,000 of them, were eventually spread across 500 camps in 50 states, from the cotton fields of the Deep South to the logging camps of the Northwest. They were often employed in essential labor to support the U.S. wartime economy, working alongside American civilians. This granted them unprecedented access to the scale of the enemy's society. The biggest shock was the American laborer. Nazi propaganda had painted the American working class as lazy, ethnically divided, and demoralized by Jewish capitalist exploitation. The reality was an integrated, highly efficient, and incredibly well-equipped
German prisoners were astounded to see ordinary workers, many of whom were women or black Americans, groups deemed inferior by Nazi racial doctrine, driving to work in their own cars. These were not luxury vehicles, they were simple, reliable American cars, a status symbol that in Germany was reserved for middle management or military officers. The mere sight of parking lots filled with personal cars outside factories was a visual, undeniable testament to a level of material prosperity that the Nazi system could only dream of achieving for its Herrenvolk. The ultimate symbol of this industrial dominance was the Willow Run bomber plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan. While not all prisoners worked there, its legendary output became known to the German officer class through captured reports and whispers among the POWs. Willow Run, operated by the Ford Motor Company, was the physical manifestation of America's ability to convert a capitalist economy into an unstoppable military arsenal. At its peak, this single factory was churning out one massive B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. This number was psychologically devastating. The B-24 was a four-engine heavy bomber, a complex machine requiring thousands of parts and hundreds of thousands of man-hours to assemble. German aircraft production, limited by lack of materials, decentralized manufacturing, and constant Allied bombing, was measured in weeks or months per similar aircraft. The reality of the B-24 rolling off the line every hour shattered the German belief in its technological superiority and its ability to outlast the enemy. As one German general later commented, the true weapon of America was not the bomb, but the assembly line. He realized that for every aircraft the Luftwaffe managed to shoot down, the American industrial machine produced an entire squadron in the time it took the Germans to replace one pilot. The truly bewildered German captives was the seemingly low level of personal sacrifice required of the American populace. They saw no widespread rationing of electricity, no starvation, and no complete governmental control over every aspect of civilian life. In Germany, the war effort demanded total austerity, extreme civilian deprivation, and a mandatory suspension of all non-essential production, even down to children's toys and clothing in the final years. Yet in America, the POWs saw a nation that was simultaneously feeding the world, fighting a war on two fronts, and maintaining a standard of living that felt like pre-war luxury to the Germans. This was the final nail in the coffin of the Lebensraum, living space ideology. Hitler had convinced his people that they were genetically superior but geographically limited, and therefore must conquer Eastern Europe for resources. The sheer sight of the American West, its vast, undeveloped tracts of land, its limitless grain harvests, its casually wasted resources, proved that the Nazi theory of inevitable conflict over scarce resources was a lie. America possessed both the genetic diversity and the geographic abundance to render the Nazi philosophical framework utterly obsolete. One German officer, after touring a large farm in Nebraska, simply stated, "We believed we were fighting a corrupt, decadent enemy. We were fighting a nation with infinite depth and resources. We were fools to have started this war." This realization was the psychological equivalent of the Falaise pocket, a complete and irreversible encirclement of the mind. The physical defeat of the Wehrmacht was undeniable by late 1944, but the true ideological breakdown occurred in the American prison camps, where the Nazis' core doctrine of racial superiority and political fanaticism was confronted not with violence, but with unexpected, overwhelming acts of democracy and kindness. The American strategy for dealing with the massive influx of German POWs, over 425,000 men by 1945, was not merely containment, but a sophisticated, multi-layered re-education program designed to dismantle Nazism from the inside out. This program created an intense conflict within the camps between the hardline fanatical Nazis, known as true believers or black Nazis, and the disillusioned pragmatic majority, the white Nazis. The POW camps quickly became micro-Reichs, replicating the political dynamics of Germany itself. The hardcore Nazis, often led by SS members or officers indoctrinated in the Hitler Youth, used violence, intimidation, and even murder to enforce the Führerprinzip. They viewed any German soldier who accepted American aid or showed signs of defeatism as a traitor. The American authorities, bound by the Geneva Convention, struggled initially to police this internal struggle, as the hardliners often operated in secret, conducting brutal mock trials and executions of their fellow prisoners. However, the American re-education effort provided the tools for the white Nazis to fight back. The program was brilliantly simple: expose the prisoners to democratic ideals and unbiased facts. Education, camps were equipped with libraries containing books that had been banned in Germany, including works on democratic history, philosophy, and factual accounts of the war. Media, POWs were given access to American newspapers and a specially created German-language newspaper Der Ruf, The Call, which provided uncensored news about the war's progress and, crucially, factual information about the concentration camps and atrocities being uncovered in the East. Lectures, disillusioned German officers and carefully vetted American academics delivered lectures on comparative political systems, the history of the United States, and the role of free press. This influx of uncensored information created a powerful intellectual wedge. For many young soldiers who had only ever heard Hitler's voice and Goebbels' propaganda, encountering factual, detailed accounts of the economic and political realities of the war was an epiphany. Perhaps the most potent weapon against the Nazi ideology was not intellectual, but emotional: the abundance of American generosity.
The American Red Cross and local communities often sent enormous amounts of aid, gifts, and packages to the POWs, especially during holidays. The sight of locals donating time and resources to their defeated enemy was incomprehensible to men raised under a system that taught total hatred for the enemy. The culmination of this kindness was often visible during the Christmas holidays. One camp administrator recalled the sheer logistics of distributing hundreds of thousands of Christmas packages, each filled with treats, cigarettes, and personalized messages from American families. To the German soldier who had been fighting for years on starvation rations, the sheer excess of the enemy's generosity was an act of psychological warfare. It taught them, more powerfully than any lecture, that the American system was not on the brink of collapse, nor was it fueled by the brute hatred promised by Goebbels. It was a nation so secure, so wealthy, and so confident in its democratic values that it could afford to be kind to its vanquished foe. The enemy that the Reich had sworn was decadent and weak had the logistical capacity to feed, clothe, house, and educate 500,000 captured soldiers, all while running a global war. This kindness undermined the entire Nazi concept of the inferior enemy and the necessary brutality of total war. It created a deep personal cognitive dissonance. How could this decadent system display such massive casual competence and humaneness? The result was the creation of the Democrat, the German prisoner who, having seen the reality of the U.S., rejected Nazism and became an unintentional envoy of democratic values. These men, upon repatriation, would carry the truth of America's industrial might and democratic spirit back to a shattered Germany. Their personal testimony would be the final, ultimate refutation of the propaganda that had cost the Reich the war. The exposure to American society did not just destroy the German prisoners' belief in their material superiority, it fundamentally challenged the core philosophical premise of Nazism, the necessity of ascetic struggle and sacrifice. The Nazis had scorned American culture as decadent, soft, and obsessed with pleasure. What the POWs discovered was that this decadence was, in fact, the ultimate engine of economic and military power. The German soldiers were shocked by the sheer size and variety of American grocery stores and consumer goods. They saw shelves overflowing with every imaginable type of food, soft drinks, and packaged goods, often sold at prices that made them easily accessible to the average civilian. In Germany, rationing had been severe since 1941, and essential goods like coffee and butter were luxury items. The most potent contrast was often found in the simplest details. German prisoners working in field labor frequently ate alongside American farmers and their families. The German soldiers were astounded by the large portions, the rich variety of meat and dairy, and the American habit of casually leaving food uneaten. This observation hammered home the fact that the enemy was not merely rich, but existed in a state of effortless overabundance that the highly disciplined, resource-starved German economy could never match. This observation led to a chilling yet logical reevaluation. If the decadent society could produce B-24 bombers every hour and feed 500,000 POWs better than the average German citizen, then perhaps the Nazi emphasis on grim austerity and constant sacrifice was not a sign of moral superiority, but a reflection of inherent resource inferiority. For the average German soldier, the technological gap was most visible in agriculture and basic logistics. The German army, despite its reputation for mechanized blitzkrieg, remained heavily reliant on horses for pulling artillery, supply wagons, and basic transport. It is estimated that the Wehrmacht used over 2.7 million horses throughout the war. The American farmer, whom the Germans were working for, used tractors, trucks, and mechanized harvesters. The sight of simple American farm trucks performing the heavy lifting that required entire units of horses and men in Germany was a powerful metaphor for the entire war. Germany was fighting a 19th century logistical war against a 20th century industrial powerhouse. This reality was summarized by an anonymous German engineer POW. We were fighting a war of steel against wood. We brought horses to fight against their trucks. We used belief to fight against their production statistics. The images of the P-47 Thunderbolt, as shown in the submitted picture, and the relentless B-24 production are direct evidence of this technological chasm. The P-47, nicknamed the Jug, was a massive, rugged fighter bomber that became the supreme symbol of Allied air superiority in the West. The German pilots who were captured and interrogated often conceded that the Allied air power was the single most decisive factor in the Western campaign, far outweighing the skill of the infantry or the panzers. The P-47s and P-51 Mustangs provided the crucial air cover that allowed the Allied forces to operate with impunity and executed the devastating Jabo attacks that turned the roads of France into a graveyard for von Rundstedt's armored reserves.
The act-craft displayed was a direct lethal contradiction to the propaganda that the Luftwaffe still controlled the skies. The Allied production lines, unhindered by bombing, delivered thousands of these powerful, reliable machines, ensuring that the critical strategic element, control of the air, was permanently lost to the Reich, crippling any chance for generals like Rundstedt to execute classic defensive maneuvers. The planes flying over the camps were not just military aircraft, they were the unshakable flying proof of the industrial system that the captured soldiers were now witnessing firsthand. The final chapter of the German POW experience in the United States was the ultimate test of the effectiveness of democratic values against totalitarian indoctrination. The program, which transformed hundreds of thousands of prisoners, was not merely about releasing them, it was about ensuring they became vectors of truth upon their return to a shattered Germany.
The overwhelming industrial reality was a passive, constant educator for all prisoners. The U.S. Army intensified its re-education efforts among the most influential groups, the officers and the young men. These men were deliberately exposed to evidence of Nazi atrocities, using films and photographic documentation of the concentration camps. For the officers, many of whom maintained the pretense that the war was a clean, professional military affair, the evidence of the Holocaust was devastating. The exposure forced a confrontation with the moral reality of the regime they had sworn allegiance to, shattering the professional distance they tried to maintain from the SS and the political crimes. The most successful subjects of the re-education program were often young soldiers, teenagers who had only known the Hitler Youth and the relentless one-sided indoctrination of Goebbels. They had not yet formed the rigid psychological defenses of the older commissioned officers. For these young men, the realization that they had been fighting and dying for a lie, for a genocidal fantasy, led to a profound, desperate sense of betrayal. These Democrats, or white Nazis, were quietly designated by the American authorities to receive preferential treatment and further education, ensuring they would return to Germany carrying the undeniable truth. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the repatriation process became the final act of this grand psychological campaign. As the POWs were finally transported back to a desolate, defeated, and bombed-out Germany, they became unintended ambassadors of American success. They returned home with stories that could not be dismissed as Allied propaganda. The scale of production. They spoke of the factories that produced planes hourly and ships daily. The quality of life. They testified to the overflowing grocery stores, the abundant electricity, and the civilian standard of living. The truth of the regime. They brought home the uncensored information about the atrocities and the strategic ineptitude of Hitler's inner circle. This first-hand eyewitness testimony from returning soldiers was far more convincing to the shattered German public than any printed leaflet or radio broadcast from the occupying Allies. The American strategy had successfully weaponized truth and prosperity. The story of the German POWs in America provides the final, chilling commentary on the strategic tragedy of men like Field Marshal von Rundstedt. Von Rundstedt's declaration, "Make peace, you fools," was a strategic judgment based on logistics and attrition. The POW experience gave that judgment its moral and ideological foundation. The generals in the field, like von Rundstedt, had the military knowledge to calculate the impossibility of victory. The soldiers in the camps had the personal experience to confirm that the entire premise of the war, that the Western democracies were weak, soft, and ripe for collapse, was a monumental lie. The images of the defeated German soldiers dressed in their prison fatigues, walking past the signs of American organization, stand as the ultimate visual epitaph for the Third Reich. Their capture and subsequent education were not just footnotes to the Western campaign. They were the final, decisive blow against the Nazi state's ability to sustain its internal narrative of eventual victory. The sheer, overwhelming power of the P-47 Thunderbolt and the B-24 bomber, produced every 63 minutes, was the physical manifestation of the industrial might that made Rundstedt's professional despair inevitable. The kindness and abundance witnessed in the camps with a psychological force that rendered the Nazi ideology unsustainable. The greatest failure of Hitler was not tactical, it was his fundamental inability to comprehend the productive capacity, resilience, and wealth of the free nations he sought to destroy. And for the men who survived to witness the truth, the memory of America became the undeniable evidence that they had been fighting a lost war, led by the very fools von Rundstedt had warned about on that fateful evening in July 1944.